All righty, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you very much for attending another new In the Garden webinar. This one is on the butterflies of Georgia. So this is mostly inclusive of all the butterflies. There are some that do come through Georgia that are not native. This isn't part of their flyway, but due to weather phenomenon, sometimes they get blown in, which happens. And from time to time, it happens with birds too. So not a huge deal, but certainly exciting for those that are looking for butterflies, different butterflies. So my name is Lisa Klein, and I am with the Agricultural Natural Resources team in Gwinnett County with UJ Extension. And I host the In the Garden series. And so we try to provide all sorts of good topics, sometimes off the wall, sometimes things that you didn't even know you needed to know, and sometimes a little surprising because it's always fun to learn new stuff, isn't it? And sometimes you know a little bit and it inspires you to go learn more someplace else. And it can spark a lifetime of learning. So we love that kind of stuff at Extension. And here in Gwinnett County, since we're mostly suburban urban, that's what the majority of what we do is we do education and outreach. So let's go ahead and get started. And just as an aside, if my slide deck interests you and you would like to have a copy of it, my email address will be at the end of the presentation, and you are certainly welcome to reach out to me for a copy of that slide deck. And if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box, and I will get to them at the end. All right, let's learn about butterflies. So this is going to be mostly stuff that you're going to see in Georgia. There might be a few in here that are from other countries, but mostly it'll be the butterflies of Georgia because that's what you're here for. You want to hear about what's good with Georgia. So if you're from out of state, you're going to learn a little bit more about Georgia. So you're going to be able to identify some common Georgia butterflies from your backyard that you'll see. You'll be able to understand a little more about seasonal patterns and the peaks in populations. You'll learn about what a host plant is, nectar sources, things like that, migratory behaviors, and how to kind of create butterfly friendly spaces. We'll talk just a little bit about that. I have a lot of other presentations that go a little more in depth into creating gardens for butterflies. So this one is just kind of an overview, but it's a little bit more focused on which butterflies you might see out there in your garden. So I like to educate folks so that they learn a little bit about the biology of whatever it is we're talking about, as well as the different species and things like that. I don't like to overdo it because, I mean, you can go down a rabbit hole when you're learning, but why? Because there's a lot of other webinars that I can create that will go into more detail about that. This is mostly just for getting a little bit of a taste of different butterflies and learning more about it. So, what's the difference between butterflies and moths? Well, that's a good question. The first and foremost one that sticks out to me is butterflies are, and this is at the bottom of the list, diurnal, meaning they're out during the day, and moths are nocturnal, so they're out at night. There are some that you'll see during the day, but mostly they're active at night. So there's about 14,000 different butterflies and about 160,000 moths that are both members of the order Lepidoptera. So that's where they're all going to be. They're going to be clustered under that order. They're both going to feed on nectar in plants, although, and most of you have probably noticed this just as a course of going through life, some of them prefer to feed on rotting fruit. So if you've ever looked under an apple tree and you've had a bunch of apples that have dropped or plums or nectar, whatever, you're going to notice sometimes you'll see some butterflies, sometimes skippers and some swallowtails and things like that. Sometimes they'll feed on tree sap. And sometimes they'll even feed on dead animals. And that's for the nutrients. So that could be salts, minerals, that kind of stuff, but they're getting something out of that. They're all going to have two pairs of wings. So, like for instance, we always tell people when you're telling a bee and a fly and the difference, bees will have more wings than flies, that kind of thing. But all Lepidoptera, butterflies or moths, are going to have two pairs of wings, and they're going to have scales, very tiny little scales. A lot of them are iridescent, very pretty. Some are kind of dull, just depends. But moths, most of them don't have those tiny little microscopic scales, such like butterflies do. So if you want to think of the butterflies as prettier than the moths, that works. Moths are going to tend to have very feathery or fuzzy antenna, and butterflies tend to have those little club-tipped antenna, or it looks like a little pin, the head of a pin on the end there. Butterflies will have a much more slender body, whereas moths tend to be fatter and fuzzier. Butterflies don't spin full cocoons. Instead, they typically will form a chrysalis. It's usually a harder backed where they're pupating. Sometimes they're brilliant colors. If you've ever seen the chrysalis of a monarch butterfly, it's very pretty. It's like a green color and it's got gold accents to it. Very pretty. Whereas a moth tends to form a full chrysalis, so it just looks like a silk chrysalis. And again, they're diurnal is what butterflies are, and moths are nocturnal. So why do they matter? I mean, some of us just think, oh, they're pretty. If you see one floating by, you're like, oh, that's such a pretty butterfly. But they do have a very important ecological function, and they're going to pollinate. They're a pollinator. Most people know that. They're probably one of the more popular pollinators. I mean, there's a whole list of them. We'll talk a little tiny bit about the pollinator census coming up. I try to weave that in whenever we talk about pollinators because it is important and you can be a citizen scientist. But they're pollinators, and so they help pollinate native wildflowers, which maintains Georgia's plant diversity. They're not as efficient because, they're just kind of floating by as opposed to a bee or something else. But they have very specialized feeding proboscis, which can go down into very long tubular flowers. Really, the only other types of pollinators are hummingbirds can do that. Bees don't usually pollinate those kinds of flowers. They're very specific. I did do a webinar where we talked about the different adaptations, I guess, to feeding. And in this case, because they have such a very long proboscis, that is adapted to like a flower like you'd see a honeysuckle or something like that. So food web connections, caterpillars, which are their young, are one of the top protein sources for nesting birds. And that can be like chickadees, warblers, that kind of thing. And just as an interesting factoid, a single group of chickadees, which we have a lot of those around here, can require 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. That's a lot. So that can be butterflies, that can also be moths. But yeah, that's a lot of bugs, right? And then they're good environmental indicators. I hear every year people call me, where are all the butterflies? I see less of them now than I used to. I used to get a ton of them in my yard. Why do I not see them anymore? That kind of thing. And so they're kind of a canary in a coal mine, so to speak, in that they respond very quickly to changes in temperature, so moving hardiness zones. If you've got fragmented habitat, most pollinators are going to be pretty sensitive to that, and pesticide exposure. So if you're in a little island in the middle of a subdivision where nobody has any kind of pollinator plants, and all around you you've got hollies and Korean boxwoods and cryptomerias, and you don't have any good pollinator plants, you're not going to have a lot of pollinators. So this is where you get into the the letter or the newsletter that you have for your neighborhood and say, I'd like to write an article on pollinators to try to educate folks. They have a good economical and cultural value. So, how many times do you see on clothing or accessories or whatever butterflies all the time? And they're very pretty. So, like you've got an orange spotted purple up there and a monarch. The monarch is the poster child for butterflies and a lot of their problems. But you're going to see signage all over the place where people care about it, a pollinator habitat, and usually you'll see a butterfly on the sign. You'll also see it as part of festivals and garden tours. It's like the poster child for gardens. And because they're so pretty and they have such an interesting life cycle, a lot of times in kids programs, you will see the use of the butterfly, the chrysalis, pupation, all of that stuff. You'll see that, and that's a good science lesson for kids to learn. So butterfly diversity. So we have in the state of Georgia about 170 plus species of butterflies, and that's some of the highest numbers in the southeast. Now, remember I said we'll have some that will come through on migratory routes, monarchs. We have some that are here all year round. It really just depends. There's tiny ones from those tiny blues. Sometimes you'll see those on mineral licks along streams to large swallowtails. You've got the giant swallowtail that comes through. And of course, they're all going to depend on host plants, which are natives. So it's very important that, with as much growth as is happening in the metro area, come back and plant gardens with native plants that these butterflies need, these special host plants. That's where their babies grow up. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But it's very important to have those native gardens where they have those plants so that they can raise their young. So 6 butterfly families for swallowtails, white sulfurs, blues, coppers, hair streaks. Yeah, I mean, science. And then there's some species of conservation concern. Monarch, of course, you've got the OE parasite, frosted elfin butterfly, the Diana fritillary, dusky roadside skippers, and the Georgia satyr. So some of those you might be familiar with, some of them you're not necessarily, and that's okay. Use this as an opportunity to do a little bit more of a deep dive so you can learn about them. So diversity. Georgia's kind of broken up into 5 different ecological regions. These are all very different, by the way. If you're out on the coastal plain, it's going to be pretty sandy soil. You're going to have more pines. It's a lot hotter, a lot more humidity. It's just one of those that's just really hot. You probably wish you weren't there in the summertime. It's very hot. There's a lot of agriculture down there. So that this is the area that was under the sea way back when we had an inland sea, and that line that separates the Piedmont and the coastal plain, that is called the fall line, and that basically means that the area below that and the coastal plain was part of the inland sea, and the area above that was not. So the upper coastal plain, again, longleaf pine. Lower coastal plain, you're going to have skippers and palmettos and things like that. It's a little more tropical. Piedmont, this is where we fall. We're in the Piedmont area. Very urban tolerant species of butterflies, swallowtails, Gulf fritillaries, things like that. And the Ridge and Valley, if you move up into the northwestern part of the state. So you have a different kind of geologic area up there, but hair streaks, you get a lot of those. And then up in the Blue Ridge, as you move up into the mountains, Rabun County, on up into the Carolinas, that's going to be Appalachian species like the Diana fritillary. They get a little bit more water up there than we do down here. Down in the Piedmont, we'll get about 52 inches of rain a year. Up in the northeastern part of the state, they'll get upwards of 75, give or take, so maybe 20 more inches of rain. It's a little bit more like a temperate rainforest. Life cycle. So we don't have to delve into this too much. Just look at the pictorial of it. You've got a butterfly. They seek out their host plant, so they're going to fly around and be attracted to the host plant. A lot of host plants are milkweed. I know we hear that milkweed is something we should plant, and that is definitely true. There are other host plants. Sometimes they are very super host specific. Sometimes they have a number of host plants that they are perfectly fine with laying their eggs on. So you get a butterfly and they lay their eggs. And then about 4 to 10 days after that, you'll get a little caterpillar that hatches out. And then about 8 to 21 days, sometimes temperature dependent because they'll munch a little bit more when it's warmer. They will eat whatever that plant is, their host plant that they're on. They'll shed their skin and they'll grow again, and they may do that multiple times. And then about, not quite a month later, 3/4 of a month, it's time to pupate. So they're going to do their big transformation. And that's when they go seek out a sheltered location, and then they will create this chrysalis. So as I mentioned, they don't spin that heavy silk chrysalis. Most of the time it's like a hard shell. Some of them are very brilliant and pretty, but they'll do that and they spend about anywhere from 6 days to 2 weeks in this chrysalis. And you can see them as they start to mature in there and go through that transformation. And you'll actually be able to see the coloration of the wings. In this case, it's a monarch, but you'll see that through the chrysalis. And then eventually, 14 to 21 days later, you will get a full-fledged butterfly. And they come out with real crinkly wings. They have to let those kind of pump up. So they have their blood called hemolymph. It gets pumped into their wings, and that helps puff them up so that they actually look like a butterfly instead of real crinkly wings. And so they'll sit there on something for an hour or two as that process happens and in the sunshine. And then once they're ready, they'll flit away to go continue their life cycle. So basic anatomy, wings, you're going to have your scales. You may have some sexual dimorphism. That means that males and females are either different in size or shape or that kind of thing. We know that when we look at a butterfly, we're usually looking at the scale patterns. And so that's the iridescence or the coloration or that kind of thing. That's how we're telling them apart. Size also. Body structure, you've got your thorax, and this is the same for pretty much any other bug that's out there. You've got your thorax, your abdomen, and then the head. You've got the antennae, which again, easy to tell. It's got that little bulbous thing on the end, and the long proboscis, that's how they feed. You also can use, as I mentioned, wingspan to kind of tell you what kind of butterfly it is. So you have some very, very tiny ones. So if you're out along a stream or something and you see a seep, you might see those little blue butterflies. That's one of the very few that we have that's a true blue. Hair streaks, which are kind of a gray. You'll see some pictures in a bit. Medium size, those are crescents and sulfurs. Sometimes you see a lot of the sulfurs flitting around your cabbage patch. And then your large, that's going to be your swallowtails, your monarchs, that kind of thing. Very noticeable butterflies, very pretty and elegant. Flight patterns. Swallowtails have a kind of a gliding flight. They're very large. Skippers, those have the real long pieces on their tail. And those kind of rapid darting from flower to flower as they're feeding. They don't just kind of flit and have the graceful elegance. They kind of like very quickly dart from place to place. Brushfoots, those are going to be kind of a looping flight from flower to flower as they're feeding. And if you're trying to identify what you're dealing with, I mean, if you can't get a picture, sometimes the movement can also help confirm what it is. So eggs. I mentioned before, it's very important that if you want that next generation of butterflies, you've got to have host plants. So that's going to be food for their larvae. They're looking for those very specific plants. There'll be a graphic here in so many slides where I have some of the host plants. But it makes sense. Go figure out what the host plants are for your favorite butterfly, and you can grow those in your yard so that you're providing the nourishment for those caterpillars. They can be laid in a single egg, like you see there, or a mass of eggs. And sometimes they're even released while the butterfly is flying. But most often they'll land on whatever plant it is, and then they'll lay the eggs. It's very species specific, and there are crossover host plants for different species of butterflies. So, as I mentioned before, sometimes they only have one type of plant they land on, but most often they're going to have a series of plants that are acceptable that they will land on. And probably the most well known is the monarch. Just simply because milkweed has that real kind of rubbery, white rubbery sap, and that they are able to convert those compounds into something that birds don't like very well. So they won't actually eat the monarch caterpillars because they know it tastes well, doesn't taste as well. And as you'll see also the viceroy butterfly, it's a mimic. It looks like a monarch, and that's I believe that's Batesian mimicry. So they have learned that if they look like the monarch, they'll be left alone. Smart, huh? So that egg is going to hatch into a larva in a few days to a few weeks. And again, with insects, it's really kind of temperature dependent. This all really happens in the summertime because of obvious reasons, because you have the source of food. But hatching temperature, as with anything that doesn't have that's not a mammal, essentially, temperature, it's all temperature dependent. So it could be 6 days, it could be 2 weeks. It just really depends if you have a cool summer. So eggs are going to hatch into these very, very tiny little caterpillars like you see over there. That's like that white egg that I showed you on the previous slide. They're going to have antennae, like you see I believe that's I think that's a swallowtail, black swallowtail. They're going to have multiple legs, and they're going to have usually some kind of brilliant coloration to try to scare away or disguise them from predators. Sometimes they will have a kind of a camouflage kind of coloration because they don't want anything to see them. So it's like either or. The caterpillars, as I mentioned, are only going to be eating their host plant, so it's very important that you offer them what they want, and they're going to grow a lot as they eat. So it's we get calls too from people that inadvertently plant milkweed or something else, not thinking that it's going to be a food source for butterflies, and then they will call us and go, "I have." Two caterpillars on my milkweed and they have completely stripped it bare. What do I do? Do I squish them? No, 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 no. Don't squish them. Go ahead and let them do what they're going to do. Those plants have evolved to deal with that. That's what they're there for. They'll put out new leaves. Don't worry about it. And in the meantime, you're helping the next generation of butterflies. So most larvae are going to spin that a silk also to kind of keep them on whatever plant they're eating on. And that can sometimes help build a little bit of a shelter so that you don't have to worry about enemies. And as I mentioned already, temperature can play a bit of a role in how quickly they will grow. And then, of course, final step, forming that chrysalis when they pupate into an adult. So the chrysalis, that's going to be, as I've mentioned before, and here's a good picture of what that really pretty chrysalis looks like. Contrast that with what a moth chrysalis looks like, the spun silk. Sometimes those look like a tomato hornworm that will end up burrowing itself into the soil. Butterflies don't do that. They're going to attach themselves to something under a table, the side of a house, usually someplace that's sheltered. And they're going to undergo a complete metamorphosis or a change in anatomy. So they start out as that caterpillar and then they emerge as that butterfly. So that body is going to break down into kind of this weird soupy mixture, and then it's going to kind of reorganize. It's a really interesting process, don't you think, that actually can happen in that little chrysalis? So special cells that were present as that larvae grow, and that's going to emerge as a different part of the adult. And that can take several weeks to months. Depends really, sometimes that last generation before the end of summer, it may hold over until springtime. So the adult, and you can see a monarch that's emerging here. So it's going to use the structures on its head, or it will kind of nibble away and allow enzymes or these alkaline secretions to kind of weaken the chrysalis so that it can get out. And then after it opens that, the butterfly, as I mentioned, it'll start to pump that hemolymph into its wings, which will then kind of expand and dry out, and then it'll fly away, assuming it's healthy. We'll talk about a little bit about some of the difficulties there with the monarchs. So then it's all about finding a mate because that's completing the life cycle, right? That's all nature really wants to do. So, excuse me. So they're going to fly around looking for a mate. In the meantime, they're going to eat nectar and other foods to try to get that energy. And then once they mate, they're going to go find that host plant. So what your job is your job is to plant those host plants so that they're readily available for them. So male monarchs, for instance, and we're just use that here because it's a more popular butterfly. They're going to attract females by releasing pheromones. That happens a lot in the animal kingdom, and that includes humans. So in other species, the female is going to release hormones. Just really depends. Some butterflies are going to migrate north or south, depending on the season. Monarchs are probably the most famous because they can migrate all the way down to Mexico, and they have distinct flyways that just like waterfowl do. And it really depends. Some of them they don't live a long time, but just the fact that they do have these complex migratory routes is pretty impressive for an insect. So I mentioned host plants, and so that's what you see here. So these are Georgia specific butterflies and host plants. So you can see here a spicebush swallowtail, and you've got sassafras trees, nectar, cardinal flower. Now, this is not an all-inclusive. This is just meant to be kind of a pictorial so you get an idea of this. Gulf fritillary, that's one we see. And a lot of times, I wish I had the time to create a chart because you'll see, depending on what part of the summer it is, you may see a lot of one particular type of butterfly and then a gap, and then you'll see a different kind of butterfly as they visit your garden and get that nectar. And so it's important that you have all the different types of host plants for all the different types of butterflies. And you can see sometimes you'll get some overlap here, but this is just a good pictorial of what you're looking for. So host plants, as I mentioned before, you need them because that is where their babies must eat to survive. They have to have that host plant. So without them, they can't reproduce. And some of them are very specialized. And so it's very important, like for instance, the zebra swallowtail, it only uses the pawpaw tree. There's not a lot of those around. That is not a very popular landscape tree. You pretty much have to go into a riparian area or an area kind of along a stream or a river or something like that to find pawpaws naturally. You can plant them in your landscape. In fact, I recommend you do. They do have a very interesting fruit. So yeah, that's something that you can consider doing. And you have to have two of them, by the way. So key reasons those host plants are important. Specialization, as I mentioned, that particular species of butterfly evolved along that particular species of pollinating plant, and so they need each other, right? Nutrition, that caterpillar needs that soft new green growth and timing. They leaf out just as those caterpillars need to eat. And then the chemical cues, kind of interesting. The females will use a particular scent and the chemistry to identify which plants are their host plant. They know that innately. And then they can't switch to close enough plants. So you have to make sure that you have good healthy plants and you have a larger stand of them. So I love that people want to put like a couple milkweed plants in, but sometimes that's not enough. So I encourage you to have, as many in a pot or as many in a patch in your yard as you possibly can. So the best host plants for Georgia landscapes, this is just an abbreviated list, really. I mean, you can do a lot more research and there are some other webinars that I've done where they really go into it a little bit more. So trees, black cherry, wild cherries, red buds, sweet bay magnolias, sassafras, and willow oaks. Shrubs, you can get spice bush. We've got our fundraising plant sale at UGA Extension Gwinnett next week, and we will have a bonus sale the day of. It will be at the Gwinnett County Fairgrounds on Thursday, March 12th between 8:45 and 5:45 in the afternoon, and we will have a lot of these for sale. Spice bush, we'll have that, and we'll have blueberries. I think we will also have some sweet spire. So we'll have some natives there, definitely. Wildflowers, butterfly weed, that's Asclepias. That is a milkweed, by the way. Passion vine, maypops, if you think that's what you call them. Partridge pea, sometimes just an innocuous little flower, that yellow flower that grows on the side of the road, but very important to pollinators. Golden Alexander, native violets, and then some little blue stem and switchgrass. Migratory behavior. So some butterflies do migrate, some don't, but there are about 600 species that have long distance migrations. So the most famous of all is the monarch. We'll just call that one the poster child for this. They typically occur in late summer or fall because, just like birds, they start responding to temperature change, nectar availability as things kind of dry up, and light changes in the patterns of light as it starts to get darker sooner. Not all of them are going to migrate. You know, as I mentioned a couple times, sometimes you'll get the chrysalis that will form and overwinter, and like with with monarchs, sometimes it's multi-generational, meaning it's going to take a while. That's a long way for them to go. So monarchs are very well studied, and Eastern monarchs born in North America are going to eventually work their way down into Mexico. And then they'll winter there, and then they'll work their way back north again. So I do know some people that have been lucky enough to actually travel down to this area and see them in the mountains there. So sometimes it can take 2 to 3 generations if they're coming from Canada area. That's a lot. And 3,000 miles. I mean, that's pretty impressive. But if you get a chance to do that, it's definitely a bucket list item. I haven't been, able to do that, but it would be really neat. And there is a distinct Western monarch population that's going to overwinter in California along the Pacific coast. Sometimes you get some of these natural disasters, and they really do a number on the populations. So, conservation and help with the species is a very important thing. So there's a lot of different ways they figure out how to get where they're going. They're going to use the sun as a compass, much like birds, polarized light detection, Earth's magnetic field, all of that. It's pretty amazing. And, I personally would love to have the ability to have a compass in my head tell me where to go. I got to use Waze. I'm not so good at directions. But they are. And yeah, what can you say? So seasonal patterns. This one's just kind of a nice little pictorial of what a monarch does. So spring, that's going to be March to May. So basically, as it starts to warm up, you're going to get species that are going to merge with their chrysalis when those temperatures rise, and they don't have a long window to do all of the things like feed and mate and lay their eggs and all of that. As I mentioned, if you've got a pollinator garden out there, you may see them in batches. So you'll see all of one particular type of butterfly, and then they seem to go away. And then you'll get another particular type of butterfly, and then they seem to go away. They're not there all year round or all summer long. They're there in distinct batches, and that's because they have distinct life cycles. So you have, let's see. Anything interesting there? In summer, June to August, that's a real high diversity period. So you're going to see a lot more in the Piedmont and coastal plain when you have a lot more blooming, I guess. And that goes for pretty much any pollination type plant. Is mostly it's going to be like probably spring to August-ish, but you'll see Like I saw a swallowtail actually the other day. I've got an Edgeworthy out in my backyard, and I saw a black swallowtail flying along. So, yeah, you'll get some early emergers, and then you will have some that will emerge later. I see a lot of them on abelia bushes and other bushes in during the pollinator census, which is in August. So you will see some there, but you'll get population peaks, much like anything else. Um, Species are going to produce 2 to 4 generations depending on which species of butterfly it is. So you might see a peak early on if we have a nice warm spring, and then you may see another one later on. Usually you'll get a big push for a big spike in the population, and then you'll have some smaller ones as you're continuing on through the summer. So the heat that we experience down here, just like with most other pollinators, somewhere between 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. That's the peak time when you're going to see the most activity. And you're also going to have a big demand on nectar. So again, things like the mountain mint and bee balm, go ahead and make sure you're planting those because you want to have a diversity of pollinators in your garden. You're not just planting specifically for butterflies. You want to really have a good diversity for all different types of pollinating insects. And then moving into fall, you've got, talking about monarchs here. So you're going to start to get a migration as they move through, and then buckeyes and sulfur butterflies. Those are seen later in the season. As I mentioned, there's usually a peak, and then species will enter diapause, which is a little bit like hibernation. So it really depends, which species it is. It depends on where the shelter, that kind of stuff. And one thing that I will mention, I have a little handout. It's called the beetle bank. Most people are like, I don't want more beetles. But note that also butterflies will overwinter there in your leaf litter. So it's important that if you can, I understand you probably don't want leaves on your grass, and that's fine because you really need to get it off your turf. But if you can rake your leaves into the back part of a yard where it can break down naturally, that's a good thing. Allowing it to break down so that you can get some of those pollinators in there to overwinter, beetles too, but to have your butterflies, maybe some moths, and your other insects, it's not necessarily a bad thing to allow that to happen and then allow them to emerge as it gets warmer, and then you can rake it up and add your new pine straw. So butterflies are not defenseless. They have some interesting adaptations. So some of them, monarchs specifically, their larvae can be toxic, which I already mentioned. They take in the sap from the milkweed, and then they convert that into a toxin. So birds have learned that they're icky tasting to stay away from them. Some are going to mimic others. I already mentioned the viceroy mimics the monarch, but also the spicebush swallowtail mimics the toxic pipevine swallowtail. So that's kind of interesting. And then I mentioned the viceroy. Some have a toxic gland called a osmeterium, and that kind of pops up and it stinks. So as it pops up, it's got a startle factor first and foremost, but then it smells kind of noxious. And so a bird that's looking at that caterpillar, look down in the bottom left. If that thing looks like it's staring at you first and foremost, so it looks intimidating, but then this yellow thing popped up and started waving at you and it smelled, if you were a bird, you probably would back off and move away. Some butterflies are going to fly very erratically. So think, a jet trying to outrun a missile or something like that. And then some are going to have camouflage coloring, like I mentioned with the eye spots. You can see that up in the top right and down in the bottom left. That's not those are not eyes. Those are just eye spots. It's a coloration to kind of scare away a bird into thinking that it's real. Usually the eyes are on the other end, and they have figured out that if they learn to rear up, they look really scary and intimidating. And so the whatever bird or predator is trying to eat it will think twice about it and sometimes move on. And then the chrysalis, it's usually disguised to look like dead leaves or bird poop or something like that because they don't want to be a tasty treat for an animal while they're trying to, rearrange their bodies into a adult butterfly. So they look and blend into the environment, much like you see that chrysalis there. There are exceptions. I mean, like the monarch and some of the others are green with gold accents, which is kind of cool. But they tend to put those in hidden areas so that they're not as obvious. So factoids. So when sometimes, if you think about back when you were a kid, if you were lucky enough to have a butterfly that landed on your hand or your arm or something like that, you probably were like, oh, wow, I'm getting a kiss from the butterfly. No, you're probably out sweating as you were running around playing, and that's what the butterfly was doing. It was actually eating your sweat, which is a lot less romantic and kind of gross, but still kind of cool. And then you have, I've mentioned this, some particular types of butterflies that don't actually feed on nectar. They eat dead stuff or carrion, dung, poop, and rotting fruit. So that's just what they choose. Um, just is what it is. There's actually another, and this isn't about butterflies, but there's something called a vulture bee. It makes honey out of dead stuff. Carrion. Look it up. It's really gross, but it's actually kind of cool. So that it'll land on something that's dead, roadkill or whatever. No, they don't live in the US. And it will consume that, much like bees, our honeybees here, will consume nectar and they make honey out of it. And you can actually buy that. It's kind of gross. Dead carrion honey. But yes, it actually exists. Nature can be kind of amazing sometimes. Um, Butterflies, just like most insects, can see UV light and polarized light. So you see that it looks like a petunia or something like that. It's going to have this UV kind of, I call them the runway lights. It's pointing at where the nectar source is. So most plants have particular types of pollinators that they favor, and they will have nectar guides or landing strips, if you will, that point at whatever, wherever the nectar is. And certain insects are attuned to those particular nectar guides, which is kind of interesting. I've talked about that a little bit in some of my other webinars. The butterfly's taste buds on its feet. That's my hand, but yes, they're on its feet. So it will taste a little bit with its feet. Flies will do that too. Proboscis and the antennae. So can you imagine tasting with your ears? Kind of cool. Um, they can't fly when temperatures are below 55 degrees. So much like reptiles or anything else that is not warm-blooded, like a mammal, it can't move around a lot. So they're going to be hidden someplace in a sheltered location waiting for it to warm up. Their ideal temperature, about 85 degrees. So right in the middle of summer. They're nearsighted and they can only see for about 10 to 12 feet, but they can see color and they're attracted to various types of color like yellows, reds, oranges, things like that. So if you have real vivid or purples, kind of fuchsias colors like that, that attracts the butterflies. So if you have a lot of flowers like that out there, you'll get more. And then I'd mentioned monarchs and the parasite OE, um, Ophrocystis electroceria. I probably bungled that. I usually just call it OE, but it's spread by spores, and you can see here, this is a blow up on the bottom part of that picture. That causes deformed, crumpled wings, and then it can't fly. And so I will state that a big problem is sometimes people want to help too much. And when you collect the butterflies, the caterpillars, to help prevent birds from eating them, because there are birds that will eat them. I know they do take in the milkweed, the sap, but some people will collect caterpillars to raise them safely and allow them to pupate and then release them. But sometimes that inadvertently exposes those butterflies to other butterflies where they normally wouldn't be in contact. And they can spread this protozoan, which then causes a lot of death. And there's a lot of groups online about this where you can go and get more education on it. And it's kind of sad because, like, especially in Florida, monarch populations have been decimated because of this. So it is something that you really need to be thoughtful about. So if you're out and about and you're walking through, a nursery and you see a lot of milkweed and you see a lot of caterpillars on there, leave them be. Don't, if you want to buy the milkweed and take it home and plant it with the caterpillar, that's fine. But just don't collect them and then try to raise them yourself, because sometimes when you congregate them, too many of them in one particular location, that can cause a spread of disease. We see the same thing in deer. You see the same thing in a lot of different organisms where they're congregating to feed in one particular location or something like that. And you see it in domestic animals too. So it's just important. Let nature do its thing. They'll be fine. How do you attract them to your yard? So again, planting nectar-rich flowers, that's a given. Some definitely milkweed. And there's a few that are non-native in there, and that's okay because that provides nectar. You just got to make sure you have their host plants. Make sure that you're growing something that's got tubular flowers, and that's for the butterflies for their feeding in the long proboscis. And then big splashes of color, so that attracts them in. So don't plant non-native milkweeds. There's tropical milkweed, and that is something that can be a problem. It's still sold out there, but if you're going to plant some milkweed, go for a swamp milkweed. That's probably the best one. The butterfly weed, the Asclepias tuberosa, that's the orange one. I think you can see that in the back of the flowers there. That one's another popular one. You see that growing on roadsides around here all the time in Georgia, usually in June. And plant the host plants of that particular species you want to attract. A puddling area, so get some gravel or stones and make sure that there's water in there for them. And then shrubs and trees where they can hide. You might want to put rotting fruit out. That'll unfortunately attract other things like yellow jackets, but put it in the back of your yard so that those particular butterflies have what they need. And just, drop the use of your pesticides if you're using some. Sometimes we don't think about it, but it's important to try to be as healthy as we possibly can. All right, so butterfly conservation. I mentioned the Great Southeastern Pollinator Census. You can be a citizen scientist. It's going to be August 21st and 22nd. It's always the third Friday, Saturday of the year. And this is a perfect time for you to go out in your garden and count pollinators for 15 minutes. And it's not just butterflies, it's, everything. And I'll be doing, in the beginning of August, I'll be doing a presentation on the Southeast Pollinator Census and teaching you how to do that. So if you're interested, you can tune back in then, or you can poke around on the Metro Master Gardener site and we'll talk more about it. All right, we'll kind of whiz through some butterflies here in the last 10 minutes or so. So you've got the cloudless sulfur. And the way I've got them lined up here is you can see a picture of the adult and then you can see a picture of the caterpillar. So if you're out and about in your yard and you see something munching on your plants, you know what it is. You can identify, oh, that's a Gulf fritillary, or oh, that's a buckeye caterpillar. There is regional variation in what these butterflies look like, both as adults and as caterpillars. So please note that this is just a representation, but it is not 100% guaranteed that caterpillar will look just like this one. For instance, Gulf fritillaries They look pretty similar to that. Pretty much any. They're going to be orange and they're going to have these spiky black protrusions. Pretty much guaranteed. Although that cloudless sulfur, it could be a lot greener. It may have narrower stripes. And that buckeye will look pretty similar to that. So you just have to kind of look, and if it's that host plant, familiarize yourself with the host plants. Look for that. Like the Gulf fritillaries, they love maypops or passion flower vine. They love that. And you're going to find a lot of those on that. So if you see a bunch of those are the Gulf fritillary caterpillars. The common buckeye, plantain, it's just a weed, but not to them. That's what they eat in snapdragon, right? Here we have the black swallowtail. That one's a pretty obvious one. And then you have the eastern tiger swallowtail. That's one of the cool ones because it's got the eye markings on there. And sometimes they'll rear up like they're trying to be all intimidating, like, yeah, you can't take me. But that's what they look like. They're kind of green, but if they get noticed, they've got the eye spots. And then you've got the cabbage white. That looks like just a fat green cucumber that moves. But the white, the wings are going to be kind of a light greenish to white and black tips. Call them cabbage worms, but I usually tell people if you're dealing with pests in your garden, plant more than you need or plant a batch away from your good batch and treat what you want to eat and then leave the ones over away from the garden for the bugs. Then you've got the American snout. So the caterpillar, I mean, you may look at it and be like, that's nothing special. It's still a butterfly. And then you've got the gray hair streak. We see a lot of those. And then the zebra swallowtail. They're not super noticeable around here. I mean, sometimes you'll see more up into the mountains. This is another one that has some of those intimidating characteristics. But this is the one that has the host as the pawpaw tree. So there's not a ton of them unless you have a pawpaw nearby, which is why I encourage you, if you can, to get a couple pawpaw trees, especially if you have a stream on your property or water on your property or riparian area, plant some because it's good. There's just not as many of them as there used to be. So it's a host plant for this particular swallowtail. You may have some. The spicebush swallowtail, this is another one of those fakers. It's really pretty, and you'll note you've got your pipevine swallowtail, your spicebush swallowtail, and then your red spotted purple, which will be, I think, be on the next slide. And they all look very similar when they're just sitting there, right? So you have to be real good at identifying. Get good taking a picture. So just take a series of shots with your picture or with your camera, and then you can go back and look at it later and determine exactly what kind of butterfly it was. So with the pipe vine, that's going to be your Dutchman's pipe. And that's one that also uses that for toxicity purposes for birds. The spicebush, obviously the spicebush and sassafras. So we do have some issues with sassafras. We've now got a new disease in the area, and it does affect sassafras trees. So hopefully we won't see a continuation decline, but that's a possibility. So planting its alternate host might be an important thing. And then you have the long-tailed skipper. They're very pretty, kind of boring looking when they're all folded up, but you can see they've got that pretty blue. And they use like the partridge pea, that little yellow flowered pea vine, and wisteria, which I wouldn't be sad if the wisteria went away, but it does serve a purpose. You got the summer azure. That's one of those little tiny butterflies, not very big at all. And it'll use dogwood and New Jersey tea. Variegated fritillary, that one, violets, pansies, passion flower. And the question mark, we see that one a lot. Elm trees and nettles. So some of them do use trees as host plants, but you can see that one looks a little threatening. If I were to see him, I'd be like, oh, I'm not going to touch him. Yeah, that's the point. And then this is the red spotted purple. So you can see it also looked like the spice bush and the other swallowtails. And then you've got the eastern comma. So very pretty, very iridescent. A lot of these up in the northeastern part of the state. The mourning cloak, very pretty. It uses willows. And the caterpillars are interesting, like in the red spotted purple. Look at the caterpillar up at the top. It looks like bird poop, which is the point, right? It's moving bird poop. It doesn't want anything to eat it. And then you've got the pearl crescent. It's an aster. It uses an aster. And the viceroy, that's the mimicry with the monarch. And the hackberry, they're going to eat dung and carrion and all the gross stuff. And they have a scary looking caterpillar too. And then you've got the monarch, of course, the host plant being milkweed, and then the painted lady. That's a pretty one. We see a lot of those towards late summer. And then the red admiral, and it's got again a scary caterpillar. Host plant is nettle. And then just when you thought when the caterpillar thought the world was over, it became a butterfly. And that's a good kind of ending note here, because we're all in various stages of emerging from our chrysalis. So maybe you're just now getting into gardening and landscaping and trying to figure out what you want to do for your yard. Maybe you've been doing it for a really long time, but you focused on vegetables or something. Maybe you just moved here and you have no idea where to start, and that's fine. Hey, we can help everybody. UJ Extension is in every county, and we are here to help folks with questions they might have about what they can put in their yard, how can they make it better, how can they help the pollinators, what kind of host plants do we need, and that's all, we can help you all with that. So that's basically it. So if you have questions, you can drop them in the chat box. I don't see a ton of them here. But let's see. I'm late. Will this be posted somewhere? Yes, it will be. You can see the Metro Master Gardener QR code down there. If you scan that or take a screenshot of it and then scan it later, that'll take you directly to our YouTube channel where I record these and put them later. It probably will be a good solid week before that happens because we have our plant sale next week and it is absolutely crazy. So I probably won't be answering too many emails or doing too much because I'll be focusing on that. Do puddling areas also provide a place for mosquito breeding? That's a good question. So you want some type of rock, so aquarium stones or pea gravel or something like that. What you're trying to do is you're trying to have just enough moisture on there that those stones are wet. So you're looking for something that butterfly can land on and then use its proboscis to get the water in between in the interstitial spaces. That's not really enough for mosquito larvae. They live in different habitats, if you will. The mosquitoes need very calm puddles of water, and that doesn't provide that. So as long as you're not allowing it to continue to fill up, and if you have a rain, you allow it to kind of filter out so that you don't have that, you'll be fine. Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. Norcross. We have a gardening class in Norcross where we teach pollinator gardening on Saturday. Okay, that's great. Yes, there are, and you're welcome to share that. There's also, if you're a master gardener, there's a newsletter from the State Master Gardener Association called Clips, and you can put any classes that you have that you offer, you can put that in the Clips newsletter that gets sent out weekly. And so that would be, and if you're teaching a particular gardening class on pollinator gardening, that is fantastic. So if you want to put that information in their address, time, that kind of thing, you're welcome to do that. Could we receive the outline you showed about various plants, trees, plant? What I'm happy to do is share the slide deck. So if you email me at that lisa.klein@gwinnettcounty.com, I will share the slide deck. And there's a lot of resources available online, a lot. So don't let me stop you from going out and doing a bit of research. You can go to the Xerxes Society. There's a lot of groups out there that have a ton of information on pollinators and pollinating plants and conservation and all of that stuff. Um, yeah, thank you. The date of the sale at the fairgrounds. It is next Thursday, March 12th at the Gwinnett County Fairgrounds from 8:45 in the morning until 5:45 in the evening. We do have a pre-sale that wrapped up last Friday. So we offer a selection of plants, both edibles like blueberries and fruit trees and things like that. A bunch of ornamentals also. And then we have a bonus sale the day of that is open to the public. So we have new stuff and we'll have some stuff that we also had in the pre-sale. But we'll have a lot of different stuff. So we encourage you, if you're interested, to come early. We'll have a lot of natives that we get from the Georgia Native Plant Society. We'll have a lot of native azaleas that we'll be getting from the Lazy K Azalea Farm down in Pine Mountain, Georgia. We'll have some vegetable plants and some herb plants that will be available for purchase. Pricing is really good, way better than the big box stores. You might have to keep them in your garage for a bit because we're not quite safe enough yet to plant them outside. But yeah, we'll have a lot of good stuff. Y'all should come check it out. So that is basically it. I don't see any more questions. Chatham County, thanks for coming. I will get this up. It'll probably, like I said, be about a week. Maybe tomorrow, but probably not. I'm actually offsite at a different function tomorrow. But yeah, we'll have lots of good stuff. I always have new things that kind of pop into my mind, some interesting stuff. And I appreciate everybody coming and spread the word. If you like learning about all sorts of interesting things, share the link with a friend. You're welcome to reach out to me directly. And Gwinnett County sometimes likes to try to charge you or give you a hard time, but we've got a back door and can get you registered in the system. It doesn't cost anything. So we just like people to learn. And that's basically it. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and I'm going to go get some dinner. So thank you all for attending. I appreciate you being here. Take